Earlier this week, Nigeria hosted the African Counter-Terrorism Summit, where the theme of that summit was strengthening regional cooperation and institution building to address the evolving threat of terrorism. The question tonight is, how significant is the threat of terrorism in Africa? Well, Babajide Ogunsanwo, founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's data analyst, is here to share more insights about the scale of terrorism in Africa. Hello, Babajide. It's good to have you on the news at 10. Good evening. This Africa Counterterrorism Summit that we've been talking about, I mean, it seems to be a special one. If you remember the people who were present, the Office of the National Security Advisor was involved in this. The African Union was represented as well. Even the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, those offices were all represented. Why is this different and seeming special this time?
There are several ways we could look at this, Anne. But I would like us to look at it from three perspectives. The first is to talk about the good and the bad news of this summit. The second will then be to look at what exactly was the National Security Advisor thinking when he advised the president to lead this summit. And third, we'll then look at the data. The first, the good and bad news. I'd like to talk about the good news before we move into the bad news. The good news is the president, by hosting this summit, is trying to fulfill part of his security promises that Nigeria will be more peaceful. And the president is saying that for him to achieve that, there has to be regional peace. In simple terms, the president has taken the position that if there is no regional peace, Nigeria is not likely to have peace, and therefore his promises for during the campaign are not likely to be fulfilled. That's the good news. So, good move by the president. Well, Anne, here's the bad news. And listen carefully to this. In 1999, the Organization of African Unity had a similar summit. They had a convention. Again, this convention was to fight terrorism. But after 1999, they then realized that beyond the convention, they needed a plan of action. And so in 2002, they then set up a plan of action again to improve security in Africa. And then in 2004, they realized beyond the plan of action, they needed a protocol. And so 2004, a protocol to improve security again. A decade after 2004, the African Union realized that perhaps to achieve their goals, they needed to have another protocol to be able to set up a Peace and Security Council for the African Union. In 2022, the African Union again went to Malabo to talk about unconstitutional change in government and a new framework to fight terrorism. Now we're here, looking at where we were since 1999, an African Counter-Terrorism Summit. The point is, in all of this, we've done 24 years of a lot of talking. What President Tinubu is saying is enough of all this talk, and is promising that there now will be action. So we've taken a look at the good and bad news. That's the first bucket. Now to the second bucket. Why is this summit so important that the National Security Advisor told the president to lead this summit? Three reasons why, and I want everyone to listen carefully to this. The Global Terrorism Index is the most reliable database globally on terrorism, managed by the Institute of Economics and Peace. They've been tracking terrorism cases all over the world in the last dozen years, since 2011. And for the very first time, Anne, last year, an African country was rated as the most terrorized country in the world. That country, Burkina Faso. Prior to now, no African country has topped that list of most terrorized nations in the world. Last year, Burkina Faso topped the list, the most terrorized country in the world. Now, you might want to find out how significant is Burkina Faso to Nigeria. Nigeria, Benin, Burkina Faso, just two countries away. And so, if you look at the list of the top 10 most terrorized countries in Africa, you clearly see that Burkina Faso is on that list. The second is, across the top 5 most terrorized countries in Africa, 4 out of these 5 countries are in West Africa. And so clearly, the National Security Advisor, Nuhu Ribadu, is concerned about this trend. So clearly we've seen that the top 10 countries that are most terrorized in Africa, Burkina Faso #1, and also #1 in the world now, Mali in West Africa, Somalia at the Horn of Africa, Nigeria, the Republic of Niger, Cameroon just beside Nigeria, the DRC, Mozambique, Kenya, and Egypt. So in front of you right now is the list of 10 most terrorized countries in Africa.
So moving forward, since that's what we're doing, what must President Bola Tinubu do at the moment to improve Africa's fight against terrorism?
In this summit, he's talked about good governance. If you take a look at what is emphasized, he's talked about the importance of why illicit mining has to stop. And if you take a look at some of his sound bites, we clearly see that the president is saying terrorism and good governance cannot live under the same roof, and he has no doubt on who has to leave the house. And so, yes, the president understands the role of small and light weapons, and the president, in summary, is saying he will take more action than what has happened in the last 24 years to fight terrorism.
All right. Thank you very much, Babajide Okunsowo, founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's data analyst, for your insight on
in the final analysis, they say terrorists are not born, terrorists are made. So clearly we need to clearly understand that the path to terrorism is to also ensure that everything that supports terrorism is reduced.
All right. Thank you very much for that closing.